Hey, welcome to another episode of the If You Mark in Your Bible podcast. I'm your host, Josh, and we are going to study Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 through 28 today. With me, I have my friend and fellow preacher, I guess you could say, out of East Oklahoma, Aaron Austin. Aaron, tell us a little something about yourself.
I'm Aaron Austin. I have been minister at the Church of Christ in Crowder, Oklahoma for over 9.5 years now. And met Josh back in, was it 2007? I was working as youth
Well done.
minister there at Moore Central in Moore, Oklahoma. And so, I'm doing the best I can to preach and help others.
Sweet. He's married to his wife who bears the same name, Aaron. So you have Aaron Austin with an A and then Aaron Austin with an E. And then what are your daughter's names?
We have Clara is 10 and Hazel is 7.
Hazel is 7. So, yeah, Aaron and I are good friends. Have some memorable moments at Six Flags that I have to save for another time, but I thoroughly enjoy getting to talk and hang out with Aaron. And so excited to have him on the podcast. Like was mentioned earlier, we're doing Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 through 28, the faith of the Canaanite woman. Just a brief background before we read it is Jesus is removed himself from Judea. He's in the Tyre Sidon region, which is up on the northern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. He's I would say he's taken this time to kind of remove himself as a retreat, for lack of a better term. Then he has this encounter with the Canaanite woman. So I'll read it, and then Aaron will kick us off as far as what we have marked in the lessons we can learn from it. It says, and Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." Excuse me. But he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and begged him, saying, "Send her away, for she is crying out after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered, "It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire." And her daughter was healed instantly. Aaron, what do you got on verse 21?
We grab our context here, and I think, like as you mentioned earlier, you look at the end of chapter 14. They had been up at Gennesaret or Capernaum, which is on the northwest coast of the Sea of Galilee, and scribes and Pharisees, once they found out that he was healing in that region, had actually come up from Jerusalem to there to ask him the questions, to try to get him crossed up in his teaching, to try to get him to mess up somehow. And that's you see the teaching we have there, the first part of 15, and as he has seemingly been completely overwhelmed by that type of thing at this point in his ministry, he can't really stay any place for very long without being overwhelmed like that. And here he goes to Tyre and Sidon to get away from all that and kind of get a breather. And I think it's neat that as he comes out here into a place that is historically not Jewish, that's was supposed to be, a part of Israel. It was Tyre and Sidon are a part of those places that were not conquered by the 12 tribes when they were supposed to drive out the inhabitants of the land. And as a result of that, here we are in the first century, and they're still very, very non-Jewish. And I see him going to that area so that he can get away from everything that he's been dealing with. I think retreat is a fairly accurate word.
Well, that's a good point. I have on the heading above verse 21 in my Bible. It has the heading that the ESV put in it, the faith of a Canaanite woman. I simply put this question: what if the Canaanite woman quit when I quit? And I think that's a question we could all ask. Maybe our child would have been healed, maybe not. It depends. And so persistence is definitely a key. I like the fact that you pointed out that he's not in Judea. He's not in a Jewish territory. He's not in an area that was conquered by Israel when they were conquering the land of Canaan. And I think that's significant. So, because, first off, he's not, for lack of a better term, on his home turf. So keep that in mind. Then we go to verse 22, and it says, and behold, a Canaanite woman. And so now, not only is he not on his home turf, but now this is a woman who is not his kinsman. It's a Gentile, not a Jew. And she says, she's a woman from that region. So Jesus, from the setting standpoint, is where she lives among her people. And I say that because she comes to him crying, saying, have mercy on me, O Lord. And some think that word, O Lord, is just a respectful term. I think she's saying it from the standpoint of the Messiah, which is why Matthew includes this statement, son of David. I think he's trying to stress the fact that it's more than her just being respectful. This is her recognizing him as the promised Messiah of the Jews. So she calls him son of David. And the reason I think that's significant is, remember, he's in her land among her people, yet she meets Jesus, at least through her statement. And I think this is the thread that's going to run through the entire passage here. She meets Jesus on his terms, referring to him as the son of David. And how many times do we hear people talk about this country, and I'm not trying to get political, just using this for an illustrative purpose. But if you come to this country among my people, then it's our laws you have to obey. It's our customs you have to respect. Does that make sense? Yet here she is putting all that aside and referring to Jesus as the Messiah and submitting herself to him. Only other really note I have is the word daughter. I circled that and just put a diminutive. The word diminutive there, meaning that we don't know how old the daughter was. A better translation would be my little daughter. And the point is, this is a term of affection. My daughter's 14. My oldest daughter's 14. She's not the youngest. I still consider her my baby girl, my baby doll, whatever. So this isn't really necessarily an indication of the age of the daughter as much as it's this mother's affection for her. What do you have on 22?
Absolutely. And I have a similar notes to what you have. And the word Lord is going to keep popping up from her. Every time she addresses him, she uses that word. And I agree completely with you. It can be a sign of simple, common authority, but with the expression the son of David, from the first interaction in verse 22, she shows the great faith that Jesus speaks of later. And her position does not change on that. And like you talk about the persistence, as I look at this passage, this is a great example of the persistence that Jesus talks about we should have in prayer in Luke 18. I mean, you see that persistence. She's still coming. She doesn't slow down. And she's had that faith from the first step. She recognizes Jesus for who he is and for what he is. And her position on that never changes, even with the response that he gives her in verse 23.
I'm glad you brought up Luke 18, the parable of the persistent widow is how it starts. I numbered the appeals by this woman. Verse 22, I put 1. Verse 25, I put 2. And then verse 27, I put 3. She makes 3 appeals to Jesus, which illustrates her persistence. We'll talk about them when we get there. But I numbered those three, labeled them as her three appeals, and then I put Luke chapter 18 next to it. What do you have for 23?
With 23, it's every time I read this, it still kind of surprises me as Jesus's response is um, he's not commending her for her faith. He's not uh, doesn't even acknowledge her, and New American Standard said he did not answer her a word, and as he just seemingly acts as if she's not even there, and it's actually his disciples that come in, and I think they get the idea of what Jesus is trying to do by removing himself from the situation, with the scribes and the Pharisees. And now it's like, oh great, now we're here, and he's still being harassed. I mean, it's almost like a celebrity paparazzi status at this point, and they're like, hey, you want us to take her away so she's not bothering you, so you can get that rest that you're looking for. But he does not even give her a word at first, and it's almost a coldness, but it's not necessarily a coldness. We understand his purpose as he states it in the next verse.
Right. He gives her the typical Jewish response.
He does.
And I would even go further and say he gives her the typical Jewish leader response. But like you said, I think this is deliberate. I think Jesus has a purpose for not answering her. I don't think he's ignoring her just to be rude.
Mm-hmm.
I do think there's a purpose behind it. I do think he is testing her. But I also wonder, who this is ultimately for, if that makes sense. Was it for her, or was it for the disciples? And
agreed.
What I find interesting in verse 22, you have the word crying. That word in the Greek is an intense shouting. And if you notice, she cries out, or she's shouting, she's trying to get his attention, and she refers to, "O Lord, Son of David." She's talking solely to Jesus. But then you come down to verse 23, it says, the disciples or the apostles respond, "Send her away, for she is crying out after us." So they include themselves in it. I wonder if their purpose for wanting her to go away is more selfish reasons than, maybe genuine concern for her. The word "send her away" there, as I was reading, could go either way. Either they're telling her to send her away, tell her to leave us alone, she won't listen to us, type thing, or they're asking him, hey, give her what she wants so that she'll leave us alone. And I think that's it based on verse 24, because he answers, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel."
Yeah.
And I put John 4 and verse 22, Jesus's conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well, when he says salvation is of the Jews. So I think that falls in the same context. But I think that's why he responds that way. I think he they say, "Hey, Christ, fulfill her wish so that she'll leave us alone." And then he answers them. I don't think he's speaking to her. I think he's answering the disciples. "I was sent out to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Essentially saying why he couldn't, or not couldn't, but wouldn't fulfill this request to his disciples. And I think it's these kind of responses that make me think that Jesus is testing this woman. I think he knows her faith from the get-go.
Agreed.
I think he's testing this woman partially for her, but more so for his apostles. And I'll touch on this as we get into verse 28. But I think there's more of a lesson here for those who are with him rather than this woman, if that makes sense. Well, so, what do you got?
I agree with you on that, because the standard of the day was that the scribes and the Pharisees and the priests, they were the well-to-do, especially with spiritual matters. To the average person, that's what great faith looked like. And I think that Jesus lets this situation play out the way that he does, because he's going to show them what it actually looks like. And with her persistence, uh, he almost puts the ball of the situation in the apostles' hands and says, "I'm only here for the Jews. What are you going to do about this situation?" And he's exposing them to what that faith is.
That's if you have a reference Bible, you probably have Romans 15 and verse 8 next to verse 24. If not, I would put that verse next to that, where Paul explains the reason Christ came to the Jews first. And the reason for this type of statement in verse 24 is not because the Jews as a nation were superior to the Gentiles. The whole purpose of what Paul says in Romans 15 and verse 8 is the only reason that Christ came to the Jews and his mission was mainly focused on the Jews, and that it came to the Jews first, and then the Gentiles were later part of the plan, was not because of anything the Jews did, and not because of their nationality, because God chooses a nationality over another, but simply because of the promise that he made to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then eventually Judah, and then David. And so you have to keep that in mind, because as we come into verse 25, or come in to the remainder of this text, it says, "But she came and knelt before him, saying, Lord, help me." So here's the second appeal to him. I like what is your you have the New American Standard?
Yes, sir.
What does yours in verse 25 say? As mine says, knelt before him.
It says that she came and began to bow down before him, saying, Lord, help me.
Okay. I think it's the King James, the American Standard, and maybe a couple others that you translate that Greek term worship, which I think is significant. And again, absolutely, you see that thread of her faith, her persistent faith running through. And I think this is a Canaanite woman in her town. Canaanites were historical enemies of the Jews, yet here she is worshiping him. She's putting aside social norms. She's putting aside nationalities. Mm-hmm. I would even argue she could possibly be putting aside religious biases and beliefs as far as her own, because we know the Canaanites and so forth were pagan people. So she could be putting all that aside to kneel before Jesus and make this appeal. And so great faith on her part. What do you have on 26? Or let me start with 26. And he answered, "It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Again, we want to keep this premise that Paul establishes in Romans 15 verse 8, that the only significant difference between a Jew and a Gentile is the promise that he made that started with Abraham, Genesis chapter 12, and went through. Dogs there is, again, another diminutive term. At the very least, it's a pet. I would even argue that this is more of a term along the lines of a puppy. It's not a disrespectful term the way that the Jews would normally use to describe Gentiles. And it's lost in the English translation from the Greek. And Jesus is not, again, showing superiority to a nationality. He's simply showing or illustrating a matter of precedence, and meaning that the priority, the order, or the process is Jew first and then the Gentile. So he's not being rude to her. He's not being demeaning to her. He's not insulting her. He's simply pointing out that the Jews, in the plan of God, the Jews come first and then the Gentiles. Same thing would hold true with us. They didn't have dog food the way we have it today, so more than likely dogs would eat what was left over. And as any good parent, you want to ensure that your children are fed before you ensure that the pets are fed. And that's the whole premise around this. There's nothing derogatory in it. It's just simply an illustration that shows the Jews first and then the Gentiles.
And like what you're saying, what you said earlier, this would be a typical Jewish response to,
Mm-hmm.
and as you mentioned, the diminutive, if I can say that word right, with dogs, essentially it would be going from dog to doggy,
Mm-hmm.
kind of a term that a child would use, but it softens the blow, and it makes it less of a insult. Where if your average Jew of the time would make the statement, it would be an insult and it would be a
Right.
bite. But
Right.
as he softens that blow, he actually comes down to where she is, and he's letting her know, hey, this isn't the insult, but yet, we still have to do things a certain way. And like you mentioned, um, the Jew first and then to the Gentile. And so he's still saying, this, it's not that it's out of propriety at this point, but he's still letting her know that there are still, a process, that the way this has to go to the Jew first and then to the Gentile, and you being the Canaanite woman, um, this isn't for you yet.
Right. A great
And
point. Go ahead.
I was going to say, and once again, I mean, the apostles are watching this, and they're looking at how he interacts with her too, because there's going to be many times they're going to be in similar situations moving forward after he leaves. Then they're still going to have to be able to handle that situation with grace. They're going to have to handle that situation with kindness. And I think he's kind of demonstrating how to do that in this point.
Hey, great point. Great point. And that's what I was just thinking, that one, she doesn't take this as an insult. Her response lets us know that she received it the way Jesus meant to send it. But I'm glad you brought that up, that this is for the apostles, because I'm reminded of Acts chapter 10 when Cornelius sends for Peter. And Peter, Cornelius and the household bow down to him. And what's Peter's thought? Get up. I'm a man just like you are. So you see that equality there. And then they receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. And Peter essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, Peter essentially says, I'm nobody to keep them from being baptized. And he ushers, and that's when the Gentiles are ushered into the church. I wonder how much of an impact this event had on Peter. And another event found in Matthew chapter 8 with the centurion, the faithful centurion. How much of these interactions that Matthew lays out for us, if that was on the mind of Peter when he ushered in the Gentiles in, it's interesting to think. What do you have on 27?
With 27, and I'm glad you brought up the centurion, because this is going to be the second time that Jesus, and I guess technically Jesus' response is in verse 28, that he mentions a great faith, but he doesn't mention it from the source that we would expect it to come from. I think more specifically that the apostles would expect it to come from. The Roman centurion, who is not a believer, that's not going to be the person that you would expect Jesus to say, hey, I haven't seen faith like this in all of Israel, or in all of Jerusalem. And so as we look at her response, as Jesus kind of makes a play on word and he softens the blow, she actually follows that metaphor. You see her still addressing him as Lord, and she says, but yes, Lord, but even the dogs feed on the crumbs which fall from their master's table. And it's acknowledging a couple things here. It's acknowledging the authority that she perceives Jesus to have. As we go back and we see the different miracles that Jesus performs with so little. I mean, you have the fish, you have the loaves, and while everybody else is looking at the fish and loaves as not a sufficient amount of food to feed everybody who's there, Jesus performs his miracle, and it was enough. And as Jesus mentions the crumbs and talking about giving it to the dogs, what she's essentially saying back to Jesus is, but if it's a crumb that comes from your table, it's going to be more than enough to sustain what I need. And where most of the time, as you mentioned earlier, they look at the dogs were secondary. And if you look into that, you see how in the first century, they treated dogs. Dogs in the first century did not have near the luxurious life that we give them today.
Right.
And they a lot of times if anybody went hungry, it was going to be the dog, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the bottom of the totem pole. They didn't have all the accommodations that we have in our culture today for them. But she says, but if the dogs feed on the crumbs which fall from their master's table, and this also, as she is claiming and she's owning that role because she uses the same diminutive that Jesus gives her.
Mm-hmm.
She embraces that, but she also says they feed on the crumbs which fall from their master's table, which is yet another way that she is placing Christ as her master, and she's another way that she is placing Christ as her Savior, as her Lord, as her the spiritual reference that we caught back up in verse 22, the Son of David. You're my Messiah. If it's a crumb that comes from your table, it's going to be more than sufficient to feed and to give me what I need. You, whatever's left over, you're able to cure my daughter. You're able to take the demon and have it leave her body. And she acknowledges his authority, and it's just another example of the persistence. And I think Jesus lets this play out because now in verse 28, he's about to say, "Hey, this is what great faith looks like."
Man, that is a great point. I didn't do this. I'm going to do this when this is done, but I will do it on the screen. Is circle that phrase, either master's table or their master's table, and draw a line up to verse 25 where it says knelt before him or worshiped him. And because I think you're exactly right. I think that phrase, referring to as their master's table, is her submitting to the authority that Jesus has naturally as God over her. I think what we're seeing here, and that's an excellent point, Aaron, is you have the creation submitting to the Creator,
As it should be.
yeah, I mean that's excellent. I underline that phrase. Yet even the dogs eat the crumbs, and I've just put this note next to it: Genesis 12:1-3. This statement and her attitude encapsulate the theology that the covenant promise with Abraham was eventually to all families, which, as you mentioned, he's given her typical Jewish responses, but she's not giving him typical Gentile answers.
Not even
And
close.
whether she realized what she was saying here or not, she's making a very valid point in the sense that you are a Jewish Messiah, but you are the Messiah for all. You're not here just to save the Jews. You came to the Jews, but you're here to save all humanity, Jew and Gentile. And you look at Paul's writing; he tears down the wall of perdition. There's neither Jew nor Greek, and everything that he put, the book of Romans, everything is essentially what she is conveying here in this statement, in her response, yet even the dogs. And I like and Crumbs is a valid point, because she is saying, I just need a very, 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 very small portion of your infinite capability to meet my needs. And I just put Mark 6:1-6 in that area when he is in, because this is a great contrast. And I make the point that it is a contrast because it's a great contrast. He's in Nazareth. He's among his kinsmen. He's among his immediate family. Yet in Mark 6, it says that he didn't perform many miracles because of their disbelief. Yet here she is just wanting a crumb. And
give me something.
And then it ties back, and then you can, if your Bible's set up that way, you can go into 29-30 when it talks about him performing many miracles, and I would put Mark 6 next to that as well, and just illustrating the fact that Jesus wanted to help. He was rejected by his own, yet here are the Gentiles who are receiving him openly. You see it in John chapter 4, after Jesus speaks with the Samaritan woman, and she goes back into town and tells them of the Messiah, and the town comes out to hear him speak.
And they all
And they
believe.
receive him. He's being tested, like you mentioned earlier, he's being tested by everybody from a Jewish standpoint, yet he goes into the Gentiles, and there's this great excitement of what there is. So, and again, I think this just goes straight back to if you're an apostle of Jesus and you think you have it all figured out, then an instance like this is making you reevaluate how you're looking at things. Verse 28, then Jesus answered her, O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire. And her daughter was healed instantly. I underline that word, "oh." And I just put the note that it's emotional admiration. And I think I think her response in 27 is great. It's one of my favorite instances in the Bible, partly because of the woman's faith, but I enjoy the response by Jesus. And that word, "oh," is important because it shows that emotional admiration she has. And when you consider the times that we see Jesus from an emotional standpoint, we see him crying over Jerusalem in Matthew 23. We see him crying at the grave of Lazarus. And in John 11, we read that in Hebrews that he cried during the garden. I'm reminded of John 6 when in John 5 he fed the multitude, and then in John 6 when he wouldn't feed them and gives them the bread of life discourse, it says they left him never to follow him again. And when he turns to disciples and says, "Are you going to leave as well?" you can almost see the disappointment. I'm reminded of everything he has to do. I would say in the upper room, washing the feet of Judas and talking about his betrayal. There's obviously emotional strain there. Luke's account of Peter denying him after he denies him 3 times, it says that he looked at Peter, him and Peter
made eye contact.
And I don't know what that look was, but I'm sure it was disappointment and pity and sympathy and all that. I wouldn't want to be looked at like that by Jesus. But here, in this instance, by a Gentile woman, you have him, I would say, filled with joy, emotional admiration in his response.
Yeah.
And I think that's, I enjoy this passage for that reason. Is she shows great faith, but you see the joy that when Jesus sees her faith, or you see when Jesus sees her faith, and her faith is come to its fullness through this conversation, he has joy. And I think that's the same today. I think it's a lesson for us today that when our faith is great, we bring joy to him and to the Father and to the Spirit and so forth. And so it ties back to that question that we asked at the beginning: what if the Canaanite woman quit when I would quit? Would her daughter have been healed? Would Jesus have had this reaction had she stopped if I would have been the one asking? And so I think this is a great I'm really glad you, for those who don't know, Aaron actually texted me with this one, and I'm glad he did. What do you have in 28?
I have as we look at Jesus admires her faith, and keep coming back to it from the apostles. Jesus says this is what faith looks like. And as I take this, I mean, I hope that as we do these texts, anytime we do a text, I hope that we find ourselves there in the passage. And for me, Jesus is essentially saying you have to, everybody potentially has that faith. Every person that you come in contact with, even if you're in a godless region, supposedly like Tyre and Sidon, faith can still be there. And sometimes as ministers, sometimes as Christians, just not even ministers, we kind of have this demographic, like the typical type of person that I would expect to have faith, that I would expect to respond favorably to the message of God, of Christ. And we get into patterns, we get into habits, and sometimes we have certain expectations of if I were to talk to this person, this is how that conversation would go. I'm not going to waste my time. I'm not going to waste their time. I'm just going to keep on moving. And if it were left up to the apostles, I think that's what they do. You go back to their response in verse 23, man, get her away from us. She won't leave us alone. Give her what she wants. Send her away. Just, man, this is awful. And to them, what is a source of displeasure? What is a source of annoyance? However they have her valued in verse 23, Jesus tells them in verse 28, this is how you should have valued her all along. And when we go through our lives, it's the parable of the sower. I mean, it's our job to sow the seed, and it's not for us to determine, no, you don't deserve a chance at the gospel. No, you're not going to respond favorably to the gospel, so I'm not even going to present you with it. But here Jesus says, listen, even here in Tyre, even in Sidon, even with this woman who we're not even supposed to be talking to in the middle of the day, we can still find faith here. And it's a beautiful example that faith can come from anywhere. And everywhere it comes from, it should be valued.
That's great. Great. I underlined, great is your faith, the statement he made to her. And just put the note, she had the faith that the Jews should have had. And I just cross-referenced Matthew chapter 8 and verse 10 in that. Also, in the top margin, which verse 28 falls on the top of the page, so this works out. But I put the Canaanite woman and the centurion in Matthew chapter 8. And they share characteristics with each other that brought about, because Jesus marveled at the faith of the centurion. Here it doesn't say he marveled at her faith, but I think it's implied in that statement, "O woman, great is your faith." But both of them had compassion. Centurion came to Jesus for his servant. She came for her daughter, for his servant, and then she came for her daughter. Both of them had humility. The centurion said, you don't need to come to my house. My roof isn't worthy for you to come here. Here, she, like you mentioned earlier, she doesn't get offended by his statement in verse 26. She doesn't tell him how it's not fair. She doesn't tell him how he's wrong. And the philosophy of Jew first, Gentile second is wrong. She simply humbles herself and says, I just need a crumb from the table of the Almighty. And then, obviously, great faith throughout. The centurion told Jesus that if you simply say it from here, he'll be healed. I think she's implying that here.
Anything you can give me is enough.
Right, because she doesn't invite him to the house or come here or anything like that. It's just, please heal her. And this interaction, I think, is summed up, and I have this next to what I just said. I have the interaction of the woman. 1, she persisted when he was silent. 2, she reasoned when he spoke. And then 3, she recognized a miracle. This miracle is a small portion of his power, which I don't know if I technically grasped exactly what she was thinking until looked in this a little deeper, but I genuinely believe she's telling him, I just need just so much. Of all you have, this is just
it's an easy thing for you.
You're right, which is a testament to her faith. I always underline immediately or instantly in verse 28. Anytime a miracle's done and inspired writers tell us that they happen instantly, I always underline that. I think it always has to be brought up. There was no, and it was always full too, in the sense that this woman, in Mark, I believe it says that she went home and found her daughter sleeping, but it was gone. Which is interesting because the daughter's asleep, which obviously would explain if you're possessed by a demon. I'm sure that's a taxing thing, physically speaking. But I think what is noticeable about that is that even though she's sleeping, the mother can tell that the miracle took place, which is a testament to the fact that it happened fully and instantly, which, obviously miracles have ceased, 1 Corinthians 13. But even today, those who who con people into thinking that they're performing miracles, the reality is they don't. There's a huge distinction between what they say is happening versus the miracles of Jesus. I also have the levels of faith mentioned here in Matthew. There are 3 levels of faith mentioned. Matthew 13 and verse 53 talked about what we talked about in Mark chapter 6, that Jesus left. He didn't perform many miracles because they had no faith. Then I have little faith, which is found in Matthew chapter 14 and verse 31. And that's when they're on the sea and Jesus grabs Peter and says, "Oh, ye of little faith." That's the apostles. So you have his kinsmen and his family, no faith. You have his apostles, Matthew 14 and verse 31. He says, "Oh, ye of little faith." And then I have the third one, great faith, Matthew 8 and verse 10, and then Matthew 15 and verse 28. And I think it's interesting. His family has no faith. His most devoted followers have little faith. But Gentiles, to whom the Jews look down upon, are the ones labeled with great faith and faith that made Jesus marvel. So, do you have anything else?
I think it's interesting that, and as we look at that, it's the great faith and the faith that made him marvel are not wouldn't be the first option if you look at that list. If you look at the family, the kinsmen, the townspeople, you look at the apostles, and then you look at those who were outside of Jerusalem altogether. You wouldn't expect the great faith to come from outside of Jerusalem. But I like to, as I look at this, and this might be speculation, but if it is, I'll definitely concede the point. But I doubt that Jesus is the first person that she came to try to help her daughter be rid of the demon. Tyre Sidon, polytheistic, they have their gods. My bet is that she's probably already hit them up. She's probably already gone there, and she knows, and she has tested the limits of those gods, and she's still found wanting. And by this time in Jesus's ministry, it's not a secret what he's done. He's performed miracles. He's driven out demons, and she knows that he's capable of doing more than the typical gods of Tyre and Sidon. And I would even say with the Roman centurion, it might be similar too. Rome, very polytheistic. We have all the myths and all that stories of all the Roman gods. But in both cases, the centurion and the woman here know that Jesus can provide something for them that nobody else can. And that's what drives them. Heal my servant. Heal my daughter. I've been everywhere else. I've got nowhere else to go. You're the only one that can do it. And until we hit that realization that we can't do it on our own, but that we have to have his mercy, we have to rely upon his grace, I don't think we're going to get to that point where we can have a great faith either.
That's good thought. I'm reminded of the woman who touched the hem of his garment, and it said,
"She's right here."
Is that what you're looking at? It says she spent
all that's there too.
Yeah, she went to all the doctors and spent all the money, but then she knew if she could just touch the hem of his garment, everything would be okay. And that's a great point. And again, goes back to the thought: what if the Canaanite woman quit when I would have quit? Would she have accomplished all?
Kind of unsettling.
Yeah, I mean, it's humbling for sure, sobering to kind of think about it, but illustrates perfectly the persistence of prayer that we should have as Christians. If you believe in prayer, it should not only be your first source of relief, but it should be your most, what's the word I want to use? Most utilized, not source of relief, but it should be your most utilized tool as well. And so,
constant.
That's great, man. You got anything else?
No, I think that think that exhausts my knowledge right there. I think we're
Man,
done at that point.
I appreciate it. I appreciate the recommendation. I appreciate you coming on and
So thanks for
sharing
having me.
time and all that. And we'll see you around for sure. But I've enjoyed it. With that,
Sounds
we'll
good.
close out.